Welcome to The Link Online. Well, I'm glad you could join us again this week. If you're watching us on Facebook Live or on the RCI website, you'll see us at our smiling faces in just a few moments after we take this tour across Canada. But I could also take this time to say welcome to World Radio Paris listeners and those listening on the shortwave service from Germany and Kauri 97.5 FM radio in Nigeria. And there we are.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, indeed.
And today in studio we have the power trio. We have Terry Haig.
Hey.
No, Haig. Not Haig. Levon Savons.
Hello.
And me, Mark Montgomery. And in the control room we have once again Marc-André Deschamps and Benoit Durand. And the man of mystery, the international man of mystery, one who is always a surprise, and very surprising at that, is
He's
He's
waving to us.
Yeah, we should get one of these cameras. Can you turn one of the cameras?
I hear he's up for the next James Bond movie.
He's there. Well, you know, he's secret man. He's got all the codes. This is a guy who has all the codes to all the. Oh, there we go.
There he is. Oh, he's waving. That's him. Oh, look. He's looking in the shadows. That's right.
The shadow man.
Okay.
Shadowy man on a shadowy planet.
Everything. Okay.
All right, we have once again a very interesting and educational and informative show coming up, as we always do, I might add. Levon, what do you have for us?
Well, I'll talk to a Canadian polar scientist about these two huge Arctic experiments that are going on in the Arctic right now.
All right. Terry?
Okay, I'll talk about a program in Calgary, Alberta that hopes to stop the radicalization of youth and young adults before they commit violent or terrorist acts.
Okay, and of course we have lots of concern about the environment this week. We had a big UN special report coming out. We have, of course, the environmental marches taking place in Montreal today, Friday, and across Canada as well. Huge marches. But we also had a report coming out this week from a scientist who studied the birds and found out that we are something like 3 billion birds short of what we should theoretically have here in North America. So those are a couple of stories coming up on The Link. All right, we're going to start out in the north, the high Arctic and so on, major international science projects. They're underway up there, and these involve hundreds of scientists from around the world, and they're seeking to understand the dramatic changes which are happening in the Arctic, which we've been reporting on for the past several years anyway. And this is something that you looked into, Levon?
Yeah, so the first mega project involves an international team of researchers on board the German icebreaker and ocean science vessel Polarstern, or Polar Star. This team set off last Friday from northern Norway on the biggest and most complex expedition ever attempted in the Central Arctic. The project is called the Multidisciplinary Drifting Observatory for the Study of Arctic Climate, or MOSAIC for short, and it involves scientists from Germany, UK, the US, Canada, China, and many other countries. Parallel to this project, there is another one operating from land in the circumpolar north. And this one is called T-Mosaic. And for more on these two projects, I spoke with Warwick Vincent. He's a polar scientist and Canada researcher at the Université de Laval in Quebec City. And I began by asking him to explain to me the difference between Mosaic and T-Mosaic.
Yes, well, both of those projects are very exciting, and they're really ways of learning about how the Arctic is changing and the ways in which we can predict those changes in the future. So Mosaic, of course, as you say, the ship headed out last week. This is a huge project. It's probably the largest Arctic expedition ever to be undertaken. It will involve 600 scientists who will be positioned near the North Pole over the course of this year. It involves primarily a ship, a European ship from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany called the Polar Stern, that's going to be frozen into the ice. It will then drift across the North Pole, and during that time it will be resupplied and supported by 4 other icebreakers a whole variety of aircraft, of course, a lot of satellite remote sensing and others, and really undertaking a galaxy of different sorts of measurements of Arctic sea ice and the ecology and physics of the Arctic right in that heart of winter darkness in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. So T-Mosaic is related. T stands for terrestrial. And our aim is to really try to understand more about what the consequences are for those changes in sea ice that we've all been hearing about for the lands around the Arctic Ocean, and including the people who live around the Arctic Ocean and who, of course, have lived there for millennia and are now facing these dramatic changes in their environment.
So Mosaic will be looking at the changes in the Arctic. Your research is looking at changes, how these changes affect the landmass and the people who inhabit it.
That's exactly right. Increasingly, we realize that those lands around the Arctic are intimately connected to what is happening in the ocean. And of course, for the people who live there, their culture and their way of lives have really been closely linked to the food web of the Arctic Ocean, to the sea ice of the Arctic Ocean, for all sorts of reasons, including just the transport along the coast.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with Warwick Vincent. He's a polar scientist and Canada researcher at the Université de Laval in Quebec City. And to give you an idea how international this Arctic science has become, a large part of that T-Mosaic funding comes from the government of Portugal through the University of Lisbon. So, we think of Canada as being this leader of in Arctic science, but in reality, there's other countries all around the world that are also interested in putting money into Arctic science because, as he said, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, and it affects certainly people in the circumpolar world, but it goes a lot further south.
Well, we've seen that with the jet stream, for example.
Absolutely.
And the wild swings that are happening much further south in temperatures and weather conditions and so on. And that has been explained to me, and probably to you as well, because the jet stream is affected by the temperature differential between the south and the north. And because they're warming up, they're getting closer together. The difference isn't quite what it used to be. And as such, the jet stream slows down, and it's like a meandering stream. Instead of just going like this in a wave, it's now going like this in these giant loops.
Yes.
In which hot weather goes way further north than it ever did before, and cold weather goes way further south than it did before, and it stays there longer. It's slower.
That's the thing that's making exactly. I did a weather story this week, and systems. Now you look at, what was the name of the one that went through the Bahamas?
The hurricane.
The hurricane.
Dorian.
Yeah. You could walk faster than it went through, and that's what's happening. It's going to affect Canada too. A snowstorm that used to just come whipping across the prairies now it spends an extra day or so and causes much more havoc. It's really it's not good news.
And the rains as well, because instead of moving
Exactly,
across, they
sure.
stay there and they
That's what happened in Winnipeg last week.
Floods.
Big time
Floods.
Yeah.
All right. So, and again, of course, we can get more information by going to the website and your story there.
And the interview is much longer. This was just a tiny excerpt. He, for example, also talked about his personal experiences in the Arctic. He's been going there to the northernmost tip of Canada, on Wertheim Island, since 1990s, and just describing the changes that he himself going there every summer has witnessed, and his own research about the microbiology of the Arctic. When we talk about the climate change and the Arctic, we tend to think about large animals, the polar bears, these majestic mammals. But climate change is also affecting the microbes, the bacteria that live in the Arctic, that are the foundation of the food web for this. So it's a very interesting interview, and I really suggest you take the time to listen to it.
It's funny because I can remember years ago, there was a news story about Inuit who, for the first time, had seen a bee. There is no word in Inuit for a bumblebee or a bee of any kind because they never got there before. But now, because of the warming, years ago, they saw a bee for the first time and said, "What is this? It's amazing, you know." And then, of course, with the ice issue, there the erosion in the north is a big deal. The shoreline erosion.
Yeah, I mean the place Word Hunt Island is 83.1 degrees north, so it's really the northern tip of Canada, and he was saying how there were these lakes that were freshwater lakes that were always covered in 4 meters and more of ice, and now in the summer there is open water. There are how these glaciers that you had 100 meters thick ice floating in the sea. It's not there. It's just collapsed. So that's in the summer, of course. In the winter, it gets really cold and it gets covered by ice again. But if you see those changes that far north, you can imagine what is happening further south.
And around the world. I mean, we've had, for example, massive forest fires or
Across the Arctic too.
yeah. Well, yeah. Was
All
it
summer.
Sweden or Norway or somewhere or Russia that had
Russia, all right across
Russia this year had record fires in Siberia, affected a lot of towns, came all the way to Canada through the north and through the Pacific Ocean. So it's really affecting now all this. I mean, our understanding has improved so much too that we know that what happens over northern Siberia is going to end up in Western Canada and in Alaska and vice versa.
Yeah, and Australia, for example, had all kinds of heat records broken in the past year because, of course, now we're heading towards winter and they're heading towards summer. And last year, for example, again, they had massive fires, but huge droughts as well because of the heat there. So anyway, once again, if you want to find out more information on that, you can go to our website, and Lavon's story is there, as are all our stories in more detail and more information and links to find out more information about these stories as well. Who's with us today?
So we have Krzysztof Sajewicz from Poland. We have Anna Mazmanian, I'm guessing in Armenia. Gustavo Lucas from Melo in Uruguay. Thank you very much for watching. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask us. I'm following our feed. And if you have any questions, we'll try to answer them.
And you can ask them in Armenian, and you can give her an answer, right?
I can can do that,
I bet you could.
Give it a try. Say hello. I'll say dzień dobry to our friend in Poland.
Anna Jan Barev.
Remember this name, Hague, in Armenia.
Well, coming up, we have a story about birds in North America and where have they all gone? Well, researchers in a new study have been able to estimate with relative accuracy the number of birds in North America, and comparing those statistics with numbers back in 1970, they came up with a rather alarming realization. There are not millions, but billions of birds that should be flying about, but instead are simply not there. And they looked at figures for 529 bird species in North America, and what they found is there are now 3 billion birds fewer than there were all those decades ago. And these include a lot of very common species. Now, I spoke with Adam Smith, one of the lead researchers. He is a senior biostatistician at Environmental Stewardship Branch of the Canadian Wildlife Service and Environment and Climate Change Canada.
So across the board, we're seeing declines in many species. More than 300 of those species are in decline, and for the most part, we're seeing declines in some of the very common species that people would be quite familiar with. So we've lost for example, more than 100 million dark-eyed juncos, a common feeder bird here in eastern Canada at least, and we've lost 140 million savanna sparrows, almost 100 million white-throated sparrows, almost 100 million red-winged blackbirds. So we've seen We see declines in individual species. Certainly, we also see them in groups of birds. In general, we're seeing grassland birds have declined as a group a great deal. More than 700 million grassland birds across North America are missing from the population that was here in 1970.
Well, this was a study on the count of birds, but any idea, and I know you didn't exactly get into this in the study, but what ideas do you have for this decline?
Yeah, and so we're dealing with more than 500 species. There are many causes on an individual species level, but on average, what we see in other work is that habitat loss is the driving force behind declines in bird populations and wildlife populations in general. And when we say habitat loss, we're really talking about the loss of the natural land cover, the land, the water, the air that these birds rely on to feed themselves, to raise their young, etc. And so we're seeing massive declines in habitat, but also the degradation of that habitat. So chemical pollutions, pesticides, etc., have a big influence on many of these species.
What effect does this have on the environment as a whole if we're losing, and I guess the figure is roughly a third of the bird population that was here a few decades ago that isn't now? What effect does that have on the environment?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question, and that's really one of the driving forces behind initiating this work for myself and my co-authors was thinking about the effect on the ecosystem at large. And when we're talking about changes of this magnitude, this many birds that are no longer out there doing things that birds do in the environment, so eating insects, and in lots of cases insect pests that affect our crops or the spruce trees in eastern Canada, etc. So the birds are no longer out there eating those insects, and they're no longer eating seeds and dispersing seeds across the landscape in the context of shifting ranges of trees, etc. under climate change. And so the loss of these individual birds is likely quite significant in terms of the functioning of the ecosystem, keeping that ecosystem healthy. The loss of this many birds also, I think, is an indicator of a broader problem. And we've seen declines, or evidence more recently in declines certainly in amphibians worldwide. There seems to be mounting evidence that insect populations are changing. And now we've also got information to show quite clearly that the number of birds flying around Canada and the United States has dropped precipitously. And so we believe this points to a broader systemic problem in our natural world, that our natural systems are not able to support the number of individual animals that they used to.
All right, so that was an excerpt of my conversation with Adam Smith, one of the lead researchers in that report. He's a senior biostatistician with Environmental Stewardship Branch of the Canadian Wildlife Service, and he's also with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And it's something you don't really think about. I mean, we get out of our houses in the morning and come to work or whatever on a Saturday or Sunday or something, and we see a couple of birds, and we don't think about that. But after talking to this guy, I started to remember when I was a kid, there used to be a lot of red-winged blackbirds around, which are very easily noticed because they have those beautiful bright red patches on their shoulders. And I thought, I haven't seen one of those in a long time now that I think about it. And the Baltimore Oriole, I used to see a couple of those when I was a kid. I haven't seen a Baltimore Oriole in years now that you think about it. So, and sparrows, of course, are very common. You think, oh yeah, there's a lot of sparrows around. People throw breadcrumbs in certain areas and sparrows come around. You think, oh yeah, no problem. But he says, like, there's hundreds of millions that are not there anymore. So it's kind of shocking in a way, especially when you consider what he said about their place in the environment. You know, I mean, they're being affected by pesticides, for example, and farmers are using pesticides because there are more bugs, and there are more bugs because there are fewer birds to eat the bugs. And so this is kind of like a vicious circle in a way. And the other thing that he mentioned as well is window strikes. Because of all the huge buildings now, all like glass seems to be the new fad. I mean, we have a new CBC building going up to replace this one, and it's all glass, 100% glass. And I'm thinking, you know, what is that going to do? Because birds are going to be flying into that, like, you know, and killing themselves. And we have a new university going up in the former rail yards here in Montreal. Again, two huge glass cubes. I think, and I'm thinking, and not only do you wonder about the environmental effect of all that glass as opposed to because of the heat and the cooling and everything else, which would seem to be counterintuitive. But then you also have the fact about what is this going to do to birds who see this as they see the reflection of trees and things, and they think it's okay, and they fly directly into it and kill themselves. So I don't know. It just strikes me as something, again, in this overall environmental concern, another aspect that we have to be worried about.
There's some good news, though.
There is. There is. So after being the bad news guy, I'll let you be the good news guy.
Well, from what I understand, after having read your story, is that there are also some bird species that have recovered, like birds of prey, like hawks and falcons and ospreys. So
and waterfowl.
Yes. So it actually shows that it's possible to improve the situation when we decide to do something about it. And I can say that, for example, I see more Canada geese now than I've ever seen before. I don't need to go hunting anymore. I just go to the pond next to my house, and it's like there are flocks and flocks of them there.
Well, actually, they've become a problem. In the 1960s, the Canada goose was threatened, and government said, "Oh, we got to stop this. We got to do something about this." And now the Canada geese are so populous that they're a problem. Not just in Canada, but I mean, there was a story in England. People are getting upset about the Canada goose because
of the
goose
poop problem.
Yeah, they
problem.
do tend
Yeah,
to.
big deal. Yeah.
They are very messy indeed. But I mean, the other thing, of course, is other things like ducks and so on are also doing okay. And according to him, he said one of the reasons for that is that we have stopped using DDT, which is one of those pesticides. But now we're using neonicotinoids or neonicotinoids. And that seems to be causing a problem as well. So
as long as killing us billions and billions of bees and other insects that we absolutely need.
Yeah, and some of that, I think I recall somebody testing honey that we buy, and because of the nature of those neonicotinoids, which is a neurotoxin, there are trace amounts in the honey we buy. So we're actually
Trace amounts in what?
in the honey that we buy.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
I'd have to re-verify that because that's from my vague memory.
Just keep it coming, Montgomery. Keep all that good news. The two of you, boy.
Well, you have.
Gosh.
We're going to get to your story, which is a little
That's
bit.
all right.
A little
I
bit.
think we have enough time.
We have a little bit of good news, which is people trying to save young people. We'll come up with that in just a moment. Well, after that relaxing music there, we have a story about...
What was that about? Rock on.
It's trying
Who
to...
shows that?
It's the people in the control room. They're trying to settle us down because
We've been too rowdy.
Dutil, he just causes problems everywhere he goes, eh?
that's all. Marc-Andre and Benoit there. They're saying those guys are a little bit out of control. We better calm the situation.
Thank God we're not disc jockeys anymore, eh?
Those were the days.
Wow.
But we
Holy
would have been in trouble for sure. And
I don't think we have enough time here. I think we should
do.
just play some more of that music.
No, we got to get to you because you have an anti-radicalization program, which is a good deal, and it's trying to stop young people from getting into trouble before they get into trouble. So tell us about that.
Well, it's going on in Calgary, Alberta. Okay, there are a bunch of programs right across the country. There's a national program to try to get young people and young adults who might be prone to settling all their disputes violently to not do it. Okay, and this particular one is called Redirect. It's in Calgary. The coordinator is a Calgary police sergeant named Gareth Joels. Totally cool guy. You could tell by the, we've all been around people on the phone, right away whether a guy's good by his voice, right? So I spoke to him this week about Redirect, which grew out of a program to try to keep kids from joining gangs. And here's part of that conversation. I guess the name of this program says it all, Redirect. So Who are you redirecting?
Yeah, great question. Our program works with youth and young adults, generally from about the ages of 16, and I think our oldest right now is about 32. And we're working with these individuals and redirecting them, as you say, I guess to work on bringing them back into the fold. So somewhere along the line, these young men and women have felt a sense of ostracization or just not belonging, and that's really probably the majority of our clientele.
Okay, so the next part then would be is what are you redirecting? You're redirecting the hurt that they suffered, that pain that they suffered that's driven them to this point.
Yeah, in a roundabout way, that's exactly what we're doing, Terry. But we really sort of want to, we take it back to that beginning. So an important part, I mean, we're an unusual team in that we're police officers and social workers working together. So, first off, we can ensure everybody's safety, but our role specifically is to develop that positive role model and mentorship with the individual, because quite often that might be missing in their lives. And, we find that we're having some good success with that, but we're not doing it alone, because we work very closely in partnership with numerous agencies, professional agencies, experts in their field that bring the clinical side and the other issues that need to be addressed as we move along and build that trust in that relationship.
Is what unites these, or what is common to all these kids, is anger above everything else?
I think that's the million-dollar question that academics and intelligence services around the world have struggled to answer. And the truth is, there is no one answer for that. We believe there are a number of factors. That includes vulnerabilities, right? Everybody has times in their lives where they're more resilient than others. Social networks with predators online, looking and perhaps preying on the vulnerable. That sense of belonging. Human nature says, and science says, that we need to belong to something that's bigger than ourselves. And then grievances is another factor as well. Just that us versus them thinking, why does that group have more than we do? No one factor makes a key, and then some of the other behaviors that we look at. Someone's strongly defending their personal view in a healthy debate. That's a normal behavior, but more worrisome for us is when perhaps they become suddenly disengaged from school and work, and they're not connecting with their family and friends, and perhaps they've picked up a new group and become very secretive. Right? That's when it becomes a little more worrisome. But again, there's so many factors and behaviors which we have online. It's a number. It's not one thing.
That was part of my conversation with Calgary Police Sergeant Gareth Joels. He's the coordinator of the Redirect program in that city that continues to try to bring back radicalized youth and young adults from the edge of the old human abyss. I mean, to try to calm the anger so these kids don't go nuts and attack us.
Mm-hmm. There was somebody who had been a former gang member in Toronto, because Toronto's had a lot of trouble with gangs and shootings and stuff in the last couple of years. And the gang member said, because the Trudeau government, the current federal government, is proposing that if reelected, they will ban certain guns. And the guy said, that's not going to change anything. He said, the problem is that when you cut the programs that these kids used to be involved with, the after-school things, the summer programs, when you cut that, they're standing around with nothing to do, and they get bored and they get attracted. They want to do something because they're young men full of energy and so on and so forth. And they end up sort of drifting into this kind of lifestyle just to have something to do at first, and then they get involved with that.
To belong. People want to belong.
Yeah, and then they say, it's them against us, and, my side versus theirs, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting situation. And of course, once again, if you want to find out more about any of these programs or interviews or things that we've talked about, subjects.
Oh,
thank you.
Yeah. Just tune into RCI. Right?
Tune into RCI. Right. Section. So now for Terry and for Levon.
Play that music again.
For Terry and Levon and myself, and for Pierre and Marc-André and Benoit, thanks for joining us this week. Tune in tomorrow. Not tomorrow. Next week. Next week at the same time for more mayhem on the link.
Actually, tomorrow might work. The show is on the website, so people can watch it.
And Saturday on Facebook as well. It's archived on Facebook as well. So there you go.
Okay, rock on, control room.